Sometimes the ones we fear the most are the ones who come to save us. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the quiet kind of love, the kind that doesn't speak, doesn't beg, but shows up night after night even when no one's watching. Welcome to Vale Marks, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. What you're about to hear is not just about a dog or a little girl or a grieving father. It's about healing. It's about the moments we never saw coming, the ones that remind us we're still human. Stay with us until the very end. This story carries a lesson deeper than words and a final scene that may just restore your faith in second chances. The wind had a way of cutting through the bones in Maple Creek. It wasn't the kind of town that made it onto postcards anymore, if it ever did. Just a few rusted mailboxes leaning sideways, empty clotheslines that hadn't seen laundry in years, and fences that groaned every time the winter wind pushed against them. Maple Creek didn't glitter. It didn't shout. It just endured. Brandon Ellis knew a thing or two about endurance. He was 46, a retired firefighter with broad shoulders and a limp in his left leg that never quite went away. After 2 decades running into burning buildings, life had gone strangely quiet. Too quiet, really. His days were mostly spent fixing up the old truck in the driveway, drinking lukewarm coffee, and waiting for the sun to come up just to have something to do. But the house wasn't entirely empty. His daughter Ellie, 5 years old and small for her age, lived with him in that creaking 2-bedroom home on Willow Street. She used to talk a lot, used to sing, too. But that was before the accident, before the rain-slick road, before the roll of tires, before the soft pink car seat in the rear flipped sideways in the wreckage, and her mother's hands went still. Since that night, Ellie hadn't spoken a single word, not even a whisper. Brandon didn't push her. He just waited, talked to her like nothing had changed, even when her only answer was the silent way her little fingers curled around his thumb as they sat together in the still of evening. And in the evenings lately, something strange had been happening. It started small, a missing cornbread muffin he'd left on the back steps. Then half a rotisserie chicken vanished from the Tupperware container he'd forgotten outside. A tin of leftover spaghetti gone without a trace. No wrappers, no crumbs. Just gone. At first, he figured it was raccoons. Maple Creek had plenty of those, clever little scavengers with twitchy hands and no manners. But there were no tracks in the snow, no upturned bins, nothing. Then one night, Brandon stayed up late. Ellie had fallen asleep early, curled up with her stuffed rabbit in the same flannel blanket her mother used to wrap around her. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that rang in the ears. Brandon sat on the porch in his old firehouse jacket, the one with the faded patch and a small tear near the cuff. The December air stung against his skin, but he didn't move. He'd left a sandwich out that night. Turkey cheese, a little mustard, just to see. And when the clock neared midnight, she came. A shadow at first, low to the ground, cautious. Brandon squinted through the dark. Not a raccoon, not a cat, a dog, a big one. She moved like she didn't belong anywhere, like every step could lead to danger. Her fur was patchy, rough with dirt and burrs. A pit bull, he realized, though thinner than any he'd ever seen. Her ribs jutted out beneath her coat like fragile bones trying to break through skin. And her eyes, God, those eyes, sharp, wide, sad. She didn't approach the sandwich like a hungry stray. She crept forward, ears pinned, scanning the shadows with practiced fear. And then, instead of devouring the food on the spot, she picked it up, carefully, gently, and turned. She didn't eat it. She carried it. Into the dark. Brandon sat frozen on the porch, not from the cold this time, but from the strange ache that had bloomed in his chest. That wasn't desperation. That wasn't instinct. That was purpose. The dog hadn't stolen. She'd retrieved. The difference settled over him like falling snow. He watched until her form disappeared down the alley between the old shed and the broken swing set Ellie never touched anymore. The swing had once been painted bright red, Luke's favorite color, but now it hung lopsided, tangled in dry weeds. It hadn't moved since the day of the funeral. Brandon had never had the heart to take it down. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he lay in bed listening to the wind, thinking of how the dog had held the sandwich in her mouth with such care. How she hadn't looked wild, just tired, like him. Maybe it was nothing, just a stray doing what strays do, but there was something about the way she moved. The way she looked back, just once, before vanishing. It felt like a whisper, a thread tied to something deeper, waiting to be pulled. And inside the quiet little house on Willow Street, where words had long since gone missing, Brandon Ellis felt something stir. Something old. Something gentle. It wasn't anger. It was wonder. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a story neither he nor that ghost-eyed dog had planned to write, but one that was ready to begin. The next night, Brandon didn't sit on the porch. He waited inside, lights off, one eye on the window and the other on the digital clock on the microwave. Outside, the wind whispered through bare branches and knocked gently against the house like it was asking to be let in. At 11:43 p.m., she came. Same shadow. Same slow, cautious movements. That pit bull with the haunted eyes padded silently onto the porch, sniffed the air, and once again picked up the food without a sound. It was half a roast beef sandwich this time, wrapped in a paper towel. She didn't tear into it. She didn't pause to eat. She just took it like before, delicate, intentional, and turned away, disappearing into the dark like smoke. This time, Brandon followed. He slipped on his old coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the night. The ground was slick with frost, and the wind nipped at his ears, but he barely noticed. His boots made soft, crunching sounds in the grass as he moved, careful not to get too close, not to make a sound. He didn't know why he was doing this, only that something deep inside him had told him to. Some thread of instinct, older than words. He followed her down a narrow alley between two abandoned homes, past a rusted-out pickup that hadn't moved in years, and through a gap in a sagging chain-link fence. The cold air smelled of old leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. She never looked back. She moved with purpose, even as her back leg dragged slightly, showing the strain of a long journey repeated too many times. Brandon watched, heart pounding. Not from fear, but something else. Something heavier. Finally, she ducked under a fallen "No Trespassing" sign and vanished into the shadows of an old playground. Brandon stopped. The place had once been full of children, squeals, laughter, the rhythmic squeak of swings in motion. Now it was a graveyard of forgotten joy. The slide was cracked and tilting, the merry-go-round rusted in place, a single swing dangling by one chain, spinning slowly in the wind. She moved to the far corner of the lot, where the moonlight barely reached, and disappeared behind the broken base of the old slide. Brandon crept closer, careful not to startle her, and then he saw them. Two tiny bodies, huddled close together beneath a pile of old clothing, rags, really. They were barely moving, trembling in the cold, their ribs poking through thin fur. One had a white patch on its eye. The other was so small Brandon wasn't even sure it was breathing. But the moment they heard her steps, their heads lifted, their tails twitched, their eyes sparkled with a joy that didn't match the place they were in. The pit bull, Gracie he would later call her, laid the sandwich gently before them and immediately began licking one of their faces. She didn't eat, didn't even try. Her focus was total. She nudged the food toward them, pressing her nose under the weakest one as if urging it to eat. Then she curled her body around them both, trying to shield them from the cold wind. Brandon stood completely still. His throat tightened. He knew that posture. that desperation. He had seen it before, in hospital rooms, in the way his wife used to press cold cloths against their daughter's forehead, even as her own body shook from chemo. In himself, when he used to stand beside Ellie's crib and whisper lullabies he didn't believe in, just to feel like he was doing something, anything. This wasn't just a dog, this was a mother, a broken, battered creature who had every reason to give up, but didn't, who had scraped together scraps and risked streets and storm and strangers just to keep her babies alive one more night. Brandon stepped forward. The movement caught Gracie's eye. In a flash, she was on her feet, standing between him and the pups, her head low, her teeth bared. She didn't growl loudly. It was more of a warning hum, not aggression, fear, protection. "I'm not here to hurt you," Brandon said quietly, his voice barely above the wind. "I just wanted to see who you were feeding." Gracie held her ground. He lowered himself slowly to the ground, groaning a bit as his knees protested. "You're something else, girl," he said, more to himself than to her. "Nobody saw you, but I see you now." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few strips of beef jerky he had brought just in case. He laid them gently on the ground a few feet away, and then slid them even closer to her. Gracie didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on him, tense and wary. But she didn't run. He stayed like that for minutes, maybe longer, knees in the frozen dirt, watching the dance between trust and survival unfold in front of him. Finally, slowly, Gracie stepped forward. She didn't touch the jerky. She sniffed it. Then, after glancing back to her pups, she picked up one strip and carried it to the smallest one. She still didn't eat. Brandon's breath caught. He felt it then, the deep, aching thing inside him that had been buried since the funeral. It rose up, quiet but undeniable like fog on a cold morning. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. When he finally stood, his joints stiff and his eyes burning, he didn't try to touch her. He didn't reach for the pups. He simply pulled off his coat and laid it beside them. A little warmth. A small offering. As he turned to leave, he looked back once more. She was watching him, not with fear now, but something more curious. Still guarded, still unsure. But the door had opened a crack, and for the first time in a long time, so had Brandon's heart. The morning came gray and cold, as most mornings did in Maple Creek. The sky hung low over the rooftops like a wet wool blanket, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from wood stoves and distant rain. Brandon didn't sleep much after what he'd seen. He kept replaying it, those two tiny puppies tucked under the old slide, and the mother dog, battered and exhausted, shielding them with her own body. No growling, no barking, just that quiet, aching kind of love that needed no sound to be understood. He knew he couldn't leave them out there another night. The cold was deepening, and even with her fierce determination, that dog, Gracie, he'd started calling her in his mind, was losing strength. And those pups, they were barely clinging to it. So, after Ellie finished her oatmeal and went back to drawing in the corner of the living room, Brandon loaded his old flannel blanket, a jug of clean water, and a soft fleece towel into the back seat of the truck. He tossed in a few pieces of grilled chicken wrapped in foil. Not much, but something. Then he drove. He parked just outside the fence, turned off the engine, and got out quietly, leaving the driver's side door open. The silence of the playground settled around him, broken only by the creak of that one lonely swing. He didn't call her. He just opened the tailgate of the truck, spread the blanket out like an invitation, and sat down on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, watching the place where he'd last seen her disappear. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, movement. Gracie emerged from the shadows like a ghost returning to a place it didn't trust. Her eyes locked on Brandon immediately. She didn't snarl, didn't growl, but every inch of her body was taut, protective. She looked at the truck. then at him, then back at the truck. Brandon didn't say a word. He just reached slowly to the side and unwrapped the foil, laying out the chicken near the bumper. Then he waited. Gracie sniffed the air, ears flicking. Then she turned and vanished back under the slide. He thought that was it, but less than a minute later, she reappeared, this time carrying the smaller pup gently in her mouth. She walked toward the truck in slow, deliberate steps, her limp more pronounced than the night before. When she reached the tailgate, she paused, staring at Brandon. He didn't move. She stepped forward, placed the pup on the blanket, and backed up. The little one squeaked, stumbled, then curled into a ball. Gracie turned, limped back, and returned with the second pup. This one was slightly bigger, more alert, trying to wag its tiny tail even as it shivered in the cold. She laid it beside the first. Brandon's heart beat hard in his chest. Still, he didn't move. Gracie stood still, uncertain. Then, slowly, she climbed into the truck. Not all the way, just enough to curl herself around her babies. She didn't look at Brandon again. He didn't need her to. He waited a while longer to make sure she was settled, then gently closed the tailgate and started the engine. Gracie didn't stir. She just kept her head low and her body curled around the pups like a question with only one answer. The drive back was quiet. When they pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickered on. Ellie stood at the front door in her yellow rain boots, her hands in the pockets of an oversized hoodie that once belonged to her mom. Her eyes widened when she saw what was in the back of the truck. Brandon parked, stepped out, and said softly, "Got some company." Ellie didn't say anything. She just walked slowly down the steps, her gaze fixed on the bundle of fur in the truck bed. Brandon opened the tailgate. Gracie lifted her head. Ellie froze. The two stared at each other for what felt like a full minute. Then, without a word, Ellie stepped forward. She moved carefully, like she was trying not to scare a butterfly. When she reached the edge of the truck bed, she sat down on the bumper, cross-legged, and gently reached out a hand. Gracie didn't flinch. Ellie rested her hand on the dog's back, light, gentle, patient. Gracie let out a breath and leaned forward just enough to nuzzle her nose against Ellie's knee. Brandon swallowed hard and looked away, pretending to adjust the blanket. They didn't bark, they didn't speak. But something passed between them in that moment, something Brandon hadn't seen in his daughter's eyes for almost a year. He carried the pups inside, wrapped in the towel. Ellie followed with Gracie beside her, step for step, like they'd known each other forever. He set them up in the laundry room with a space heater, a water bowl, and a stack of folded blankets. Gracie curled up immediately, pulling her pups in close. Ellie knelt beside her, watching, wide-eyed, silent as ever. That night, while Brandon was in the kitchen making tea, he heard it. A voice, not loud, not clear, but real. "Mommy used to sing in this room," Ellie said. Brandon turned. She was still sitting with Gracie, one hand resting on the mother dog's back. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. His hands trembled just slightly as he poured the tea. Up until that night, he had believed silence was permanent, that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. But then came Gracie, a dog that didn't bark, a child that didn't speak. And somehow, together, they found the words. Maple Creek had a way of whispering things louder than it should. It started with a glance. Then a murmured conversation behind the fence. Then the whispers turned to rumors, and the rumors found their way into inboxes and community bulletins. And before Brandon even realized the wind had shifted, it hit him in the form of a folded notice taped to his mailbox. Complaint filed. Unauthorized keeping of dangerous animals. At first, he didn't believe it. Then he saw the name signed at the bottom. Nancy Holloway. She lived 2 houses down in the corner lot, the one with the pristine flower beds and the no trespassing sign painted in neat cursive. Nancy was in her 70s now, with silver hair always pinned back and lips drawn tight like she was perpetually tasting something sour. Years ago, her grandson had been bitten by a neighbor's dog, a large shepherd mix that had snapped at him through a gate. The boy had survived, but the scar on his cheek became the scar she carried everywhere. Since then, she'd never trusted dogs again, especially big ones, especially pit bulls. Brandon stood in the driveway for a long time, the letter still fluttering in his hand. The chill in the late afternoon air had nothing on the weight he now felt pressing on his chest. He knew how fast things could go wrong. He'd seen it on the job before. Good intentions turned sideways because someone panicked. He had no permits, no paperwork, no training certificate for Gracie. She was just a stray he'd taken in. And the pups? Unregistered, unvaccinated, at least officially. If the complaint moved forward, they could be removed, taken away, seized as a potential threat. It didn't matter that Gracie hadn't so much as growled since the day she arrived. Didn't matter that she slept beside Ellie every night, curled around the little girl like a living shield. None of that would count on paper. That night, Brandon couldn't eat. He sat on the couch with the letter in his lap, watching the shadows crawl across the living room walls as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Gracie lay on the floor nearby, her head resting on her front paws, eyes half closed, but still alert, always alert. The pups were snoring softly in a tangle of fur and blanket beside her. Ellie was at the coffee table, scribbling something in her drawing book. Brandon cleared his throat. She looked up. "Sweetheart," he said, voice low. "Can we talk for a second?" She nodded and scooted closer, curling up beside him on the couch with the quiet trust of a child who didn't know how fragile life could be, but had learned anyway. Brandon took a breath. "I got a letter today." From the town, Ellie blinked. Someone scared about Gracie. They think she might be dangerous. That she doesn't belong here." He paused, watching her face. Her mouth stayed still, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the couch cushion. "I don't want to," he said gently. "But if they force us, we may have to let her go, just to keep you safe." For a moment she didn't respond. Then she sat up straighter, her back rigid, eyes fierce in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. "She keeps me safe," Ellie whispered. Brandon froze. "She makes me feel warm," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Like Mommy used to." Gracie lifted her head slightly at the sound, ears twitching. Brandon blinked fast, his eyes suddenly stinging. Ellie turned toward him. "You said we help family," she added, as if repeating something he had once taught her and had long forgotten himself. He nodded slowly. It was true. He had said that. Once, back when everything felt more certain. Back before the accident, before the hospital rooms, before the silence. He looked over at Gracie. Her eyes met his. Not pleading, not afraid. Just steady. And in that moment, he saw it all. The night she carried food instead of eating it. The way she'd stood guard over her babies in a freezing park. The stillness with which she let Ellie lay her hand on her back. The way she slept facing the door, always between his daughter and the world. She hadn't barked, hadn't bitten. She didn't need to. Her presence spoke volumes. And somehow, the girl who hadn't spoken in almost a year had found her voice again. Because of this dog. Because of Gracie. Brandon leaned back, exhaling hard. He reached over and gently pulled Ellie into his arms, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We're not letting her go," he said, voice thick but sure. "Not now, not ever." That night, while the pups dreamt of muddy fields, and Ellie curled under the same blanket her mother once wrapped around her, Brandon sat at the kitchen table drafting a letter of his own. Not angry, not defensive. Just the truth. About a dog that never barked, a girl that never spoke, and the quiet miracle that had happened between them. It started with a cough. At first, Brandon thought it was nothing, just a tiny sound from Luna, the smaller of the two pups, barely louder than the hum of the space heater in the laundry room. But by the next morning, the cough had turned into a wheeze. Her tiny sides heaved with effort. Her eyes, usually bright, looked glassy, and when he reached down to pick her up, she didn't squirm or nuzzle like she usually did. She just lay limp in his hands. Brandon didn't wait. He grabbed his coat, gently wrapped Luna in one of Ellie's softest blankets, and opened the back door. Gracie was already there, standing, watching, as if she knew. He opened the truck door. Without a sound, Gracie leapt in. Pip followed, tail twitching anxiously. Ellie stood on the porch, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Will she be okay?" she whispered. "I'll do everything I can," Brandon promised. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, tucked behind a row of shuttered storefronts. The faded sign above the door read, "Maple Creek Animal Care," its letters worn from decades of wind and sun. Brandon hadn't been inside since Luke's childhood dog had passed away. That had been a different time, a different life. The bell chimed as he pushed the door open. Behind the counter stood Dr. Ava Moreno, a woman in her early 60s with gray-streaked hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun and eyes that had seen too much. Her white coat was neatly pressed, her name stitched in blue above the pocket. She looked up from her paperwork and froze. Gracie was the first thing she saw. A pit bull, thin, scarred, muscular. Ava's jaw tightened. Brandon noticed. "I need help," he said gently, stepping forward. "It's the puppy. She's having trouble breathing." Ava didn't move right away. Her gaze flicked to Gracie, then to the pups. She inhaled through her nose, her body stiff. "I can't have an aggressive dog in here without a muzzle," she said finally, the words automatic. "She's not aggressive," Brandon replied. "She hasn't barked once since I found her. She's a mother, that's all." Ava's lips pressed into a thin line, but she gestured toward the side room. "Put the puppy on the table," she said. Brandon obeyed, laying Luna down as gently as he could. The little pup let out a faint whimper, then stilled. Gracie tried to follow, but Ava held up a hand. "She waits out here." Brandon hesitated. Gracie didn't. She sat by the glass door of the exam room, pressing her nose against it, paws twitching anxiously. As Ava examined Luna, took her temperature, checked her heartbeat, listened to her lungs, Brandon explained everything. The rescue, the night he followed Gracie, the pups under the broken slide, Ellie's silence, the day his daughter spoke again for the first time in nearly a year. Ava said nothing for a long while. She finished her exam, then moved to the counter, scribbling notes. "It's likely an upper respiratory infection," she said. "Not uncommon in puppies without proper shelter. She'll need fluids, antibiotics, and warmth. We'll have to keep her here for observation." Brandon nodded. "Whatever it takes." Ava glanced again at Gracie, who now paced restlessly outside the glass, whining softly. "She'll be okay," Ava said quietly, surprising herself. Brandon stood, preparing to leave, but Gracie wouldn't budge. She planted herself right outside the exam room door, sat down, and stared at her puppy. When Brandon tried to call her to the truck, she didn't move. When he opened the door wider, she stepped back, not out, just closer to the glass. That night, Gracie didn't leave. Ava closed the clinic at 6 p.m. sharp, like she always did. She flipped the closed sign, shut off the overhead lights, and turned to lock the front door, only to find Gracie lying across the threshold, chin resting on her paws, eyes locked on the door to the exam room. She didn't bark. She didn't whine. She just waited, all night. When Ava arrived the next morning, Gracie was still there, covered in frost, shivering, but awake, watching. Ava knelt beside her, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. She reached out with a gentle hand, hesitated, and then laid a slice of sausage breakfast sandwich on the concrete. Gracie sniffed it, then pushed it gently aside with her nose. Ava frowned. "You're hungry," she said softly. "Aren't you?" Gracie stared at the exam room door. Ava stood, walked inside, and opened the kennel. Luna lifted her head weakly, blinking against the light. The medicine was working, but it would take time. Ava watched her for a long moment, then turned to the window where Gracie sat. "She didn't eat," she murmured to herself. "She just waited." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Ava placed Luna's kennel near the front window so Gracie could see her. The moment the pup appeared, Gracie let out the softest sound, something between a sigh and a whimper. Ava watched them, mother and daughter, separated by glass, bonded by something deeper than fear. She whispered to no one, "This dog, she knows pain, she knows fear, and she knows love." And slowly, a woman who had once feared pit bulls more than fire began to believe in something else. That love, no matter the shape it takes, can change everything. By the time Luna was well enough to come home, the house had changed. Pip greeted his sister with a frenzy of licks and playful yelps, while Ellie carefully placed a tiny knit scarf around Luna's neck, a gift she'd made with Brandon's old flannel shirt. Brandon watched from the doorway, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a few days, it felt like things were finally settling. But Gracie, something wasn't right. She had waited at the clinic each night until Luna came home. She'd laid in front of the door, refusing to move, eating less and less each day. And now that Luna was safe, it was as if Gracie had exhaled, and with that breath, let go of something she had been holding too tightly. At first, Brandon thought she was just tired, but the signs became clearer. She stopped finishing her meals, even the ones Ellie prepared by hand. Her steps grew slower, her eyes dimmer. By the third day, she struggled to climb the porch steps. That night, Brandon found her curled in the corner of the laundry room, shaking lightly, her breaths shallow and uneven. He didn't wait. He scooped her into his arms. She felt far too light, and drove through the night, back to the clinic. Ava was already there, working late. She looked up as the door opened and saw Brandon carrying Gracie like he would a child. One glance, and she didn't need words. In the exam room, Ava moved with urgency but care, placing Gracie on the table, checking her vitals, gently pressing her stomach, shining a light into her eyes. "Her temperature's low," Ava murmured. "And she's dehydrated. Looks like a mild infection. Nothing we can't handle." Brandon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "But she's also exhausted," Ava continued, her voice softer. "I mean, truly depleted. I think she's been running on instinct and willpower alone. Her body's just now catching up to everything she's been through." Gracie didn't lift her head, but her eyes opened slowly, shifting toward Brandon. He stepped closer, resting a hand on her side, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breath. "I've seen this before," Ava added, "in war dogs, rescue dogs, mothers." She started an IV, added fluids and antibiotics, and dimmed the room lights. "She's not in danger yet," she said, "but it's her choice now." Brandon stayed the night, sitting cross-legged on the cold tile floor beside the kennel. Gracie lay curled, still and silent. In the early hours, Ellie arrived, blanket in hand, drawings tucked under her arm. "I made these for her," she said, holding out a stack of colored pages. One showed Gracie standing tall beneath a rainbow. Another had the words, "We love you, Mama," written in big, uneven letters. Ellie knelt beside the kennel, carefully taping each picture to the glass. She whispered as she worked, barely loud enough to hear. "Don't go, Mama Gracie. We need you." She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat and waited, her hand resting lightly against the glass. For 5 days, Gracie didn't move much. Ava monitored her closely, adjusting medications, coaxing her to eat. Volunteers from the clinic took turns sitting with her. Brandon came each morning before work, Ellie each afternoon after school. Every day, Ellie added a new drawing. On the 5th morning, the drawing was different. It was a picture of Gracie standing outside their house, surrounded by hearts. A small stick figure, Ellie stood beside her, arms outstretched. Brandon was in the background, holding a leash and smiling. Ava placed it on the wall just as she had the others. And then it happened. That evening, Ava walked into the room to check Gracie's vitals, and froze. Gracie was standing, not tall, not steady, but up. Her front legs shook slightly. Her breathing was slow, but stronger. And when Ava stepped closer, Gracie turned her head, eyes clearer than they'd been in a week. Ava knelt, reaching out. Gracie didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, just one step, and rested her head gently against Ava's arm. Ava didn't speak for a moment. Then she smiled. "You're not just surviving, are you?" she whispered. "You're choosing to live. For them." That afternoon, Brandon got the call he'd been praying for. Ellie danced through the hallway when she heard the news. Pip barked as if he understood every word. And that evening, when Brandon pulled the truck into the driveway and opened the passenger door, Gracie leapt out slowly but surely, legs still stiff, but her tail wagging with quiet determination. Ellie stood at the top of the porch steps, arms outstretched. Gracie climbed them, step by step. And when she reached the top, Ellie threw her arms around the dog's neck and whispered, clear and strong, "Welcome home, Mama." The words hung in the cool spring air like a song. Brandon stood back, eyes stinging. Gracie lowered herself beside Ellie, her head resting against the little girl's knee, her body finally at peace. The house seemed warmer somehow, fuller. In the days that followed, Gracie improved quickly. She ate again. She slept in Ellie's room. She even barked once, just once, when a squirrel dared to approach the bird feeder. Pip and Luna never left her side, curling into her each night like they'd done since the beginning. Ava came by on the weekend, not as a vet, but as a guest. She brought treats and a small framed copy of Ellie's rainbow drawing. "She saved my faith," Ava said, smiling as she placed the drawing on the mantel. "And I thought I was here to save her." That night, as the family sat on the porch watching stars flicker over Maple Creek, Brandon reached down to scratch behind Gracie's ears. "You came back," he said softly. "You chose to stay." Gracie looked up at him, eyes bright in the starlight. And though she couldn't speak, the message was clear. She had found her reason, and she wasn't letting go. Spring deepened its roots in Maple Creek, painting the town in soft shades of green and gold. The wind that once bit through cracked fences now carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh soil. And in the quiet neighborhood near the edge of town, something new had bloomed. Not just from the ground, but in the hearts of those who had nearly forgotten how to hope. Out front of the Ellis home, just beside the porch steps, Brandon had built something simple. He called it Gracie's porch. It wasn't grand, just a small hand-built awning made of pine and weather-treated beams. Beneath it, a patch of soft grass had been carefully trimmed and planted, where morning sunlight landed first. There was a thick wool blanket folded in one corner, a stainless steel water bowl always filled, and a second bowl where Brandon placed fresh food each day, sometimes kibble, sometimes bits of roast chicken Ellie sneaked from her plate. A carved wooden sign hung from the porch rail, smoothed at the edges, etched by hand. Gracie, not just a survivor, but the heart of this home. Gracie rested there most afternoons, soaking in the sun with her head tucked gently between her paws, watching the world go by. She didn't patrol the yard anymore, not unless she felt like it. She didn't have to. This was her place now, her sanctuary. And Pip and Luna, they were no longer the trembling pups rescued from beneath a broken slide. They had grown into strong, joyful whirlwinds of fur and mischief, chasing butterflies and each other around the yard like it was the most important job in the world. Every morning, they circled Ellie as she waited for the school bus, and every afternoon they raced to greet her when she returned, their tails wagging like flags in the wind. Ellie had changed, too. She talked now, laughed, sang. Her voice, once locked away in silence, now filled the corners of the house again. And though there were moments, quiet, sudden ones, when her eyes still clouded with memories, those moments didn't stay long, because Gracie was always near, always listening. Every evening just before sunset, Ellie would curl beside Gracie under the porch roof, her knees tucked beneath her and her backpack beside her. She'd open one of her picture books, or sometimes just talk, about her day, her classmates, the funny things Pip did at breakfast, or the dream she'd had the night before. Gracie never interrupted. She just listened, and that was enough. One afternoon, as Brandon was trimming the hedge, he saw someone approaching the fence. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, heart tightening just a little. But then he saw the glint of silver hair, the careful steps, the way her hands clutched something to her chest. Nancy Holloway, the same woman who had once filed a complaint to have Gracie removed, who had spoken about danger and liability and the fear she carried from years ago. Now she was standing by the gate with a soft, tired smile and a velvet collar in her hands. It was embroidered by hand, small yellow daisies along the band, and in neat cursive stitching, the name Gracie with a tiny heart beside it. "I didn't come to apologize," Nancy said quietly. "I came because I saw something I didn't expect to see. I didn't change, not really. I just started seeing more clearly." Brandon took the collar gently, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and walked away without another word. Ava Moreno visited often, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing but time. She liked to sit on the porch with Brandon while Ellie played nearby. They spoke about dogs and people, about loss, and what it means to heal. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just watched as Gracie dozed in the sun, Pip and Luna tumbling through the grass. "Do you remember when I didn't want her inside the exam room?" Ava asked one evening. Brandon chuckled. "Yeah, you looked like you were staring down a grizzly bear." "She's changed me," Ava said, "in ways I didn't think were possible." Gracie lifted her head, blinked slowly, then placed her chin back on Ellie's shoe. Brandon smiled. "She's good at that." And then, on a golden afternoon that smelled of lilacs and baking bread, Ellie asked a question Brandon hadn't seen coming. He was sitting on the porch swing, fixing the wooden leg of Pip's toy, when Ellie sat down beside him, legs swinging gently. "Dad?" she asked. "Yeah, Peanut?" She looked toward the blanket where Gracie lay, eyes half closed, tail thumping lazily every time Luna walked by. "Is she my mommy too?" Brandon paused, his hands stilled on the screwdriver. He looked at his daughter, her soft, curious face, her eyes not filled with sadness but a searching kind of love. She wasn't asking about biology. She wasn't asking for replacement. She was asking from a place of belonging, of soul. He reached out and brushed a lock of hair behind her ear. "In every way that matters," he said softly. "Yes." Ellie smiled, satisfied, and leaned her head against his arm. Later that night, Brandon sat alone on the porch, the house quiet behind him. Gracie lay nearby, curled beneath her sign, moonlight pooling across her fur like silver dust. He thought about how she'd come into their lives, silent, cautious, carrying food into the shadows. A thief, some might say, but not him, not Ellie. Gracie hadn't stolen anything. She'd returned something they'd lost. And in the hush of that peaceful night, as a soft breeze rustled the leaves, Brandon whispered, "You saved us, girl. All of us." Gracie didn't move, but her tail gave one slow, steady wag. If this story touched your heart even for a moment, don't leave quietly. Leave a comment. Share what Gracie gave you. Subscribe to Veilmarks, because with every new subscriber, you're not just helping us reach 1,000. You're giving us the strength to keep crafting stories that matter, stories that heal, stories that whisper in the language of hope. You're not alone. As Maya Angelou once said, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." Let this be a story you carry with you, a reminder that even the quietest acts of love can echo the loudest. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.